This was a tricky one because you've seen over 2,000 movies, including most of the ones I wanted to recommend based on your four favorites, which are Velvet Goldmine, House, Female Trouble, and Daisies. So you've got a mix of campy films that are queer and/or gender bending, as well as films that are surreal and experimental with an anarchic or chaotic energy. The first film that popped into my head that you didn't have marked as watched was Liquid Sky. It's got this stylish punk, glam rock, new wave, gender bending vibe like Velvet Goldmine. It's a bit bizarre and surreal like House. Like Female Trouble, it's transgressive and a little edgy. And like Daisies, it's got this avant-garde, rebellious spirit. Orlando, like Velvet Goldmine, feels glamorous and androgynous. Like House, it kind of plays around with time in a way that feels a bit surreal. And like Female Trouble and Daisies, it feels kind of subversive and rebellious for the way it challenged certain social norms. The Living End, like Velvet Goldmine, is a queer film with great music. Like Female Trouble, it's campy and so quotable. Like Daisies, it leans into this sense of anarchy and rebellion. And like House, it feels like death is after these young people and they're trying to escape it or confront it. Forbidden Zone is a queer film that revolves around music like Velvet Goldmine. It's got absurd, over-the-top visuals like House. And like Female Trouble and Daisies, there's this idea of deliberate bad behavior or acting in a way that's seen as offensive. Also, it has a cult following like Female Trouble. I Love You, Philip Morris is a queer film where Ewan McGregor is one of the stars like Velvet Goldmine, and like Female Trouble, the protagonist engages in criminal activities. I always compare Daisies to Celine and Julie Go Boating, even though they're very different. There's just something about these films that are playful and experimental and follow two women that remind me of each other. But I especially want to recommend this one to you because you also have House in your favorites, and like that movie, this film involves peculiar things that happen inside of a particular house. Smithereens is set against the backdrop of a music subculture like Velvet Goldmine, and like Female Trouble, it has that gritty underground sort of vibe, and the protagonist is a narcissistic runaway. The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert has a glam, campy, gender-bending vibe like Velvet Goldmine. There are two newer movies that I think might fit your vibe. The first is Messy, which I know was one of John Waters' favorite films the year it was released, and you obviously have a John Waters film in your favorites, but the characters in this film speak in such a crude and unapologetic way that I think as a fan of John Waters especially, you'll enjoy it. And the next one is Fuck Toys, but I don't know if this movie has a release date yet because I don't know if it ever got picked up for distribution. But if this movie gets released this year, I would be willing to bet it ends up being one of your favorite films of the year based purely off the vibe I got from your four favorites. It's queer, campy, gender-bending, experimental, surreal, chaotic, rebellious, whimsical, quirky, just all the things I think you could want in a movie. Speaking of campy, gender-bending, surreal, chaotic, quirky movies, you might also like Diamantino. Sweet Home, like House, is a Japanese horror film about a haunted house with some really interesting practical effects. Even though the taste of tea isn't the same genre, there's something about the dreamlike atmosphere and sometimes surreal visuals that makes me think you might appreciate it as a fan of House. I also think you might like Alice for similar reasons. Speaking of surreal visuals, the experimental nature of some of your favorites makes me think you'd enjoy Holy Motors. I feel like this is going to seem like a totally out of place recommendation that doesn't fit in with your favorites, but I wanted to recommend a Douglas Sirk film because you've got a John Waters film and a Todd Haynes film in your favorites, and both of them have cited Douglas Sirk as an influence. Although that might be more obvious in Far From Heaven than Velvet Goldmine and Polyester than Female Trouble, but I'm going to recommend Written on the Wind. And if anyone thinks it's an odd choice, I can't speak for anyone else, but I feel like sometimes melodrama and camp go hand in hand. Case in point, my next recommendation, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. Not only is it melodramatic and campy, it's flamboyant, over-the-top, chaotic, and colorful, and I think it fits in really well with your favorites. Tag, like House, is a horror movie involving Japanese schoolgirls where things get pretty bizarre. Since you already saw the movies I'd normally compare to Female Trouble, I'm going to recommend Citizen Ruth, because both films are dark comedies with unlikable female protagonists who are used by other characters for their own ulterior motives. You didn't have This Filthy World marked as watched, but I feel like there's a good chance you've already seen it, but I'm going to recommend it anyway just in case, because I think it's definitely worth checking out for any John Waters fan. The Fireman's Ball, like Daisies, is a Czech new wave satirical comedy. Dick is campy like some of your favorites, but it's also a political satire that follows two young women cheerfully causing mischief like Daisies. I feel like I didn't include enough campy and queer films, so I'm going to throw in one more for good measure and recommend The Birdcage.